loading up. Here we go. Hi, Founder fans. Thank you for coming. We think we're loading. I don't see myself yet. Where's my picture? There I am. Excellent connection. Hi, Founder fans. As always, I have trouble going live, but thank you for your patience. I see people are already signing in. TJ and Matthew. So nice of you both to be here and already commenting. I'm very excited, TJ. I saw your comment from yesterday. You weren't sure if you'd make it. I am certainly glad you're here. Everyone coming in, thank you all. Also, if you leave a comment, I'll know who you are. Until then, anonymously, thank you for coming. Please hit like. I would really appreciate that. And we are about to discuss the American Revolution. It's going to be a romping good time because we're going to, as always, discuss the last 7 founders, which I published biographies or stories about on founderoftheday.com. Before we get going, real quick announcement, and I meant to throw this out on Patreon, but it's been kind of a crazy week. I left town for a little bit, but exciting news. We are going to start having interviews on Founder of the Day. Starting tomorrow, I am going to be publishing. I've already done 3 of them, and I have a surprising amount of people are very excited to talk to us about their part in the revolution. And many of them are authors of books, but not all of them. I have Michael Troy from the podcast will be coming next week. The American Revolution podcast will be coming next week. Certain people who sell American Revolution related things will have at least one interpreter here. It's all very exciting. And I know Matthew, I believe, pointed out that we didn't want to just necessarily hear about them saying, buy my book. And I think I've done a very good job of, I will at the beginning tell you their book and say, here's a link. But for the most part, we're just talking about information. And I mean, starting tomorrow, spoiler alert, we're going to talk about Christian Despigna, who Founding Martyr is one of my favorite books. I'm honored that he took the time to talk to me, and he just goes off about it. So I look forward to that, but I don't want to take too much time. Hi, Josh. Nice of you to show up. How's New York City? Let's get into the good stuff while you're here. The American Revolution. We're going to start with Elizabeth Graham Ferguson. Now, I have Googled how to pronounce her name. It's spelled Graeme, and the interweb told me it's Graham. If that's wrong, it's probably wrong, but that's how I interpret it. So Elizabeth Graham is a fascinating character, and if you recall, for those of you here last week, we spoke a lot about the Rush family. Dr. Benjamin Rush is a signer of the Declaration. We talked about his brother and niece, and while I was researching that family, I came across Elizabeth Graham. She is a very interesting character. She came from the Graham family of Philadelphia, a very wealthy family, and she was engaged to the son of another wealthy family, and this man's name was William Franklin. That rings a bell. It's because his daddy was Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin, you assuredly already know, or else you probably would not be watching a channel about the American Revolution. If you don't know, his son, William Franklin, was his son, and would end up being royal governor of New Jersey, who remained loyalist during the Revolution and was essentially kicked out of the United States. Now, when he was a younger man, he was engaged to this woman, Elizabeth Graham. He went to London to study law, and during the separation, the 2 years he was in London, there was a miscommunication of sorts. They were engaged, but it seems, and it's hard to decipher exactly who said what, that turned things weird, but he seems to have been under the impression she didn't want to date anymore, so he sent her a breakup letter and married someone else. She was heartbroken for a while and decided to travel. Apparently she traveled to London and traveled around England for a while. Now, I could not determine if they actually saw each other while they were both over in England. I don't think so, but I really looked for it because I really wanted to have that awkward interaction to tell you guys about, but unfortunately I can't. However, while she was traveling, she kept a diary, a journal, a travel journal, which was popular at the time. When she returned to Philadelphia, her mother had passed away, so she took on the hostess duties for her father. Now, her father, as I said, was very wealthy, and he ran kind of what they would have called a salon out of the house, or what we would call a social club. And what they did here is it was mostly the more famous artists and poets of the day. For example, Francis Hopkinson, who created many of the early artwork for the United States, including the seal of the United States. He was a poet who ended up going to their house, and every weekend they'd have poets over at their house and writers and talk about the arts. And she grew up in this community, and then when her mother passed away, took over running this community. So she's there. Dr. Benjamin Rush, the reason he led me to her is he read, and many of her friends read her journal. She never published it, but she let them read it. And he thought, and many of them thought, she was one of the finest literary talents of colonial Philadelphia. Now, she ends up marrying a gentleman named Ferguson. His name was Hugh Henry Ferguson. I keep calling him one or the other, but it's actually Hugh Henry Ferguson. She marries Hugh Henry Ferguson and becomes the name that we know her as today, Elizabeth Graham Ferguson. Elizabeth Graham Ferguson at this point was already translating a book which I believe is pronounced Les Adventures de Télémaque. I can't speak French. I took a lot of it in high school. I still can't pronounce it. Les Adventures de Télémaque. And this book was a multi-volume epic poem in French. Now, she started before the American Revolution translating it and would finish when George Washington was president decades later because it was so many volumes. And she translated it to rhyme for the most part, which is very difficult to do when you're changing languages. A very impressive feat. As I said, that would take decades. During the time she's doing this, she marries Hugh Henry Ferguson, and then the American Revolution breaks out, and Hugh Henry Ferguson sides with the Loyalists. Now, Elizabeth Graham, her father didn't know she eloped with Ferguson when they got married, and he died just about a month later. So he died not knowing his daughter had married. Therefore, in his will, he had left her all of his property. Unfortunately, she was a woman back then, not now. Being a woman is fine with me, but in colonial and pre-revolutionary America, well, you just simply couldn't own property if you were a woman. That's an unfortunate fact. And therefore, when her husband sided with the Loyalists, she stuck with the Patriots. And her husband actually left. And quickly, right after he left to go to England, Elizabeth Graham went to George Washington. And two things happened. First of all, she went to ask if her husband could just return for a visit to collect some of his belongings and give her the property that her father had willed to her. Her father had willed her this property, but because she was married, it was her husband's property. So she wanted it back, and she wanted to talk to him because of that. Additionally, she carried a letter to George Washington from Jacob Duce. And I don't want to get too sidetracked with Duce, but he was a preacher in Philadelphia and was asked to be the first chaplain of the First Continental Congress and was very important to the early revolution in Philadelphia. However, when the Continental Congress ran away from Philadelphia because the British were coming, he stayed. And while he was there, he was interrogated by the British. And after they left, he had, we'll say, a change of heart about what was happening. And he wrote a letter a fairly famous now letter to George Washington saying, hey, maybe we should sue for peace and just put all this behind us. Again, I'm not getting too into Duce, but Elizabeth Graham Ferguson was the one who brought this letter to Washington. And she said, hey, read this. Also, can my husband come visit? And Washington went, no. I just got really bad news, or bad advice, I should say. No. So, first of all, she would never see her husband again. What she did do is she spent the next 2 years fighting to get her land because the Continental Congress, when her husband, who technically owned this land, became a loyalist and left, much like they did to many loyalists who left, the Continental Congress confiscated this land. Now, fortunately for Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, she was very well connected. As I said, she was close with Benjamin Rush and Francis Hopkinson, both of whom signed the Declaration of Independence. They had some sway, and she was able to get her land back. And it's interesting because this is I saw someone call it I think they phrased it as pseudo-proto-feminism. Because it wasn't feminism, it wasn't really even proto-feminism, but it was the type of action during the revolutionary change that the American Revolution brought forth that led to women getting almost rights. Like, they did let her have her land back that they had confiscated. And, again, it's not that big a moment in the revolution, but it's one of hundreds of small moments where women got a little step forward that over the next several centuries would slowly help bring equality to the country. After the war ends, Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, she's still going by this name, she has her property back. She finishes this multi-volume, I don't remember if I wrote how many volumes it was. It was like 12 volumes or something crazy like that. And she actually has her friend Elias Boudinot, who is a former president of the Continental Congress, living in New Jersey. He contacts George Washington on her behalf because she wanted to dedicate the book to George Washington. Despite the fact that 20 years earlier they had that little inconvenience, she still wanted to dedicate the book to her, and she did. And it is an amazing work from an amazing writer who, unfortunately, not a lot of her work survives. We only have part of that initial journal left from someone else's diary. That's Elizabeth Graham Ferguson. I'm going to check to see if we have any questions. No. For those of you watching the questions, Josh Craddock is an old friend of mine. And the party alarm is something we do when we celebrate. Party alarm, woo, 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 woo. It's more fun when you're at a hockey game or a baseball game because you can do it really loud and it makes sense in context. So let's continue to Friday. Now, as I've mentioned recently, we recently changed. I finished all the Federalist Papers, so now I'm doing the Anti-Federalist Papers. And as we discussed several times in the last few weeks, it's not super easy. It's not as easy to organize the Anti-Federalist Paper as the Federalist Papers. So this week, I'm discussing John Dewitt. John Dewitt is not a real person. John Dewitt is the pen name of one of the first Anti-Federalists to publish Anti-Federalist content in regards to the American Constitution. We don't know who the real name is. Most of the Anti-Federalist Papers, we can estimate who probably wrote it, and at the very least narrow it down to these 2 or 3 people. John Dewitt, we have no idea where it came from. So, what we can tell you, first of all, is the pen name John Dewitt seems to have come from a Dutch man who lived a century before the American Revolution, whose name was Johan de Witt. Now, Johan de Witt was a real person. He lived in the Netherlands. And I'll remind you, the Netherlands was one of the first modern nations to have a republic. They came together as separate states, the Netherlands, almost like the United States, the Netherlands. Most countries don't have the in front of the name. But they were a republic of separate states that came together under essentially a constitutional monarchy, but in a much more republican style than we have in other states. And Johan de Witt was very much in favor of republicanism. He thought it was best for the people instead of monarchy. Now, he was celebrated for a while until the Netherlands were invaded, at which point those people he was championing, those very people he was trying to help, were really unhappy they were invaded and blamed him, and he and his brother were hung in the town square. That's where the name comes from, since I figured I'd tell you that since I can't tell you who actually wrote it. Now, there were 5 papers, Anti-Federalist papers, written by John Dewitt, or the pseudonym John Dewitt. The first 3 are the most important. 4 and 5 are really not looked at historically as very important at all, because by the time those came out, the first one was written in October 22nd of 1787, and the second one was written on October 27th. So 5 days apart in late October, just 6 weeks after the Constitution was signed. The other 3 came out in November and December, and by that point there were other Anti-Federalists writing historically more important criticisms. What's really interesting about DeWitt's, they were called the Letters of John DeWitt, and the first letter is extraordinarily interesting because it doesn't really attack the Constitution like we're accustomed to with Anti-Federalist information. The first one is more of a, hey everyone, let's calm down now. Let's reflect a little bit. That's essentially my Bob Ross impression, which is more or less the way when you read John DeWitt Letter 1, it feels like it's written by Bob Ross, because he's just saying, all right, everyone, we need to take a step back. Now, this is an interesting start. And I should note, in the conclusion, he writes, I'll say, quote, I'm, quote, as much a federal man as anyone else. And by that, he means, I also think we should have a federal government, which is not what you hear most anti-federalists say. But he comes right out and says, I think, in so many words, says, I think we should have a federal government. I should. But you guys wrote this over a summer, and no one else has had a say in how we put it in, and now suddenly we're having ratification conventions already, weeks later, and we're just going to accept it? Like, this is a big decision. It's going to last for a very long time. We should do it right now, and we should all, every voting citizen, should reflect on what this means, and if it's right for our children's children. Which is a great point. It's seemingly hard to argue on either side. And most states would take at least till the next spring before they voted. Now, in the second letter, he starts to talk a little bit more about the document itself. And his main problem in the second letter is there's no Bill of Rights. He says the federal government is simply just too big to not have a Bill of Rights. Now, as I've mentioned, the Federalist Papers were mostly written in response to anti-Federalist papers. And the Bill of Rights was not commented on. If I'm not mistaken, Hamilton didn't even mention it until paper 83 or 84, one of the last 2 or 3 Federalist papers, when he finally addresses it. And the Federalist argument was essentially, well, each state has a Bill of Rights, and the states are more important to protecting the rights of the people. So the federal government doesn't really need one. Now, as we know, one of the first things the federal government did was create a Bill of Rights, because almost everyone who ratified, most of the states who ratified the Constitution sent a note along with it that said, give us a Bill of Rights. More or less is how that went down. I will say in the first 2 essays, he does touch on some of the problems that he sees with the federal government. 3, 4, and 5, those letters, as I said, are not quite so important, but he does talk about it, and he does say his main concern is the Senate. He thought that the Senate would eventually overpower both the President and the House of Representatives, and the United States would eventually turn into an oligarchy. It's really the main problem I saw in those. He just saw that it was inherently unequal. And he didn't think that the militias would be prepared. Again, things that would be addressed in the Bill of Rights. So that essentially is John Dewitt, the pseudonym, who was one of the first, published about the same time as any other original anti-federalist paper. So, if you guys have any questions, now's the time. Not yet. Thank you for watching, though. Yes, I'm answering all your questions as I go. And as I pull this up, I will say I'm also wearing short sleeves. I'm very uncomfortable in them, but it's hot, so I'm doing it. I know that's unrelated, but, you know, you come here for J. Mandrish and the Revolution, I would presume. So, let's talk about John Henry. John Henry was a Continental Congressman from Maryland. He had gone to the Continental Congress at just 27 years old. Again, at first, the Continental Congress was very important, but once independence was declared, the states were essentially independent nations, independent of each other as well. So many of the, we'll call them elder statesmen, went back home to run their state. That's why a 27-year-old kid could be sent to the Continental Congress representing Maryland. Now, the Constitution was a bunch of people in a room, they all agreed to it, and they all signed it. The Declaration of Independence was a bunch of men in a room. Most have agreed to it. A month later, some delegates were replaced, and the whole room signed it. Although the Declaration did have some people trickle in later and say, "Hey, can I still sign that?" And they're like, "Okay, yeah." And then the same thing with the Articles of Association, also known as the Continental Association, after the first Continental Congress. Bunch of guys in a room came to agreement, signed it. The Articles of Confederation were a little bit different. The Articles of Confederation, a bunch of guys in a room agreed to it, and then sent it to the separate states. And the states debated it and decided whether or not they wanted to ratify it, kind of like the Constitution. And then they would send instructions to their delegates at the Continental Congress, okay, we've accepted this, now you can sign it. And whoever was the delegate at the Constitutional Convention would sign on behalf, whoever was the delegate at the Continental Congress would sign on behalf of their state. These people were very, very tied to the instructions from their state. It's one of the things that took the Declaration of Independence a little while to be approved. It's why it took several weeks, because New York, for example, abstained from voting on the Declaration of Independence until they received further instructions. And that was good enough for everyone else to say it was a unanimous decision. Anyway, I bring this up because we are talking about John Henry from Maryland. Maryland was the last state to approve the Articles of Confederation. So therefore, they were the last ones to sign it. What would happen is when the instructions came in, the delegates from that state would, okay, we did it, we signed it. So it took several years. People signed the articles over several years. Maryland had John Henry there saying, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet, because several reasons, but most notably, Virginia. If you look at a map now, Virginia is right next to Maryland. It's a whole lot bigger than Maryland. And Maryland's real issue was, back then, Virginia didn't just have Virginia. It also had West Virginia. It also had most of Ohio and most of Kentucky, and it also had a big chunk of Tennessee, and it also had a good portion of Indiana and some of Illinois, and it also had some of Michigan, and it was huge. It was gigantic. So, Maryland said, wait. I'm not going to sign into this government and then let Virginia have every piece of land west of the Mississippi. It'll obviously absorb the rest of the states. Until eventually, Virginia finally said, okay, you know what? We will cede our western lands to the Continental Congress as federal land. And they did this, and this became the first federal land owned by the federal government. If you want to call the Articles of Confederation a federal government, I wouldn't, but you could. The agreement included that private landowners who owned property out there would still retain the rights of ownership to that land. So your George Washingtons and Patrick Henrys and many, many, many other peoples, mostly from Virginia, but also from Pennsylvania, they would still own the land that they wanted to make all this money off of. It just wouldn't be in Virginia. That was a compromise. And John Henry spent almost his whole career in the Continental Congress, 4 years, saying that. And then eventually he was recalled. He did go back home to attend to private business. And then he would return for 4 more years. Just so happens that that year and a half he was gone is when Maryland finally approved the Articles of Confederation, and a different set of delegates from Maryland signed it. So unfortunately for John Henry, he spent all this time saying, not yet, and when the time finally came, he was back home. Tissues and teardrops. Not so bad for Henry, though. He would end up going and becoming he would work in the Maryland state government, and then when the Constitution was signed, he was an inaugural member of the United States Senate. Back when there were 13 colonies, as I love to say, there were only 26 people who sat in the United States Senate that first day it opened. One of those people was John Henry. He also then went on to spend a year as governor of Maryland, but he didn't do too much. He did reorganize the state militia while he was governor of Maryland, but he resigned after 1 year because he had poor health, apparently, and that's a good idea because he died just a month later at only 48 years old. So, John Henry, I hope you enjoyed that. As per usual, if you're new here, I have to take a sip of my coffee every little bit. It's really gross. If you could sing out loud to yourself so you don't hear me drinking, that would be really fantastic. I appreciate it. But if you haven't noticed, I'm talking a lot. And it's late at night, so I don't drink coffee throughout Wednesdays. I save it for now, and then I stay up late and giddy after you guys leave me here by myself. I mean, I have other people in the house, but you understand my sayings. Let's talk about John Cook. John Cook was briefly do we know why he died? You know what, Matthew? As soon as I said it, I thought that. Actually, when I was rereading the article from this week, I thought that. I was like, I should put in why he died. I don't know why he died, and I apologize. He knew he was sick, which is why he resigned. I remember that very specifically. And it was just a month later that he did die. So I would assume it was something along the lines of tuberculosis. Now that's a guess, it's an assumption, but it's the type of disease where you would suffer from for a while and then die, but it wouldn't prevent you from going about your life. You know, like if he had like smallpox or anything that had a serious fever he was carrying around, people knew about diseases were contagious. They didn't understand germ theory, but they knew you could catch certain things. But you can catch TB, and they didn't seem to care about that. My guess would be TB. I will look that up, Matthew. You know what? I got my trusty notebook. That's why I got this notebook, right? How did J. Henry die? We'll find out for you, my friend. I promise. It is going to be hard. Now that I say I promise, it's going to be one of those where I'm looking for like 6 hours. And it's just nowhere to be found. But I will find out. Oh, mark my words. That's my favorite part about Founder of the Day, is that I get to waste hours of my life looking up pretty random things like this because I enjoy it clearly a lot. So, let's talk about John Cook, unless there's another question coming in. No, John Cook. John Cook was a senator from Delaware. Let's see. John Cook was sheriff of Kent County, Delaware, for well before the American Revolution. And then the Revolution breaks out, and he likes law and order, so he hangs around and is still sheriff, but he's not real excited about the Revolution. He doesn't take a side, he doesn't make an announcement, he just kind of stays as sheriff until independence is declared, when finally he says, well, I like living in America, and if I want to stay living in America, I'm going to have to be an American. And he sides with the Patriots. This aroused some suspicions with certain political leaders, because he didn't jump on board right away, although many people did not jump on board right away. In fact, many people never jumped on board at all. But most of those people didn't hold political office, because sheriff was an elected position. And John Cook, I wanted to say John Henry, John Cook was not only elected sheriff, but his community seemed to care for him, because they then elected him to go to the state constitutional convention. They're like, oh, we're going to be independent, well, let's send Sheriff John, he'll take care of it. And he did. And as soon as they wrote a constitution for the state of Delaware, I'm sorry if I said Maryland, the state of Delaware, he was elected to the state senate. And again, there were people suspicious, but he was serving his community. He did a pretty good job. He was there for many years. Eventually, he worked his way up and became Speaker of the Delaware State Senate, a pretty important position. Along the way, he was actually nominated for Delaware Supreme Court, although those who were suspicious of him were able to make that not happen, and they chose a different nominee. Fine, says John Cook. Whatever, is I'm sure exactly how he phrased it. He stayed as Speaker of the Delaware State Senate. And then something strange happens. Now, we need to take a sidestep here. There's a man named John Dickinson, who, if you've watched it all, you've probably heard me talk about. John Dickinson is one of the most underappreciated American founders. He's up there with Robert Morris as one of the most important Americans you've never heard of. Unless you're watching this channel, then you've heard me talk about him. But most Americans don't know the name. John Dickinson was extraordinarily important. I'm going to skip all the important stuff he ever did and note that Pennsylvania and Delaware, for most of their colonial history, had one governor. They had separate assemblies, but one governor. Then the American Revolution happened, and they wrote separate constitutions and had separate governors. And John Dickinson was from Pennsylvania and from Maryland, and he was governor of Maryland. And then he was elected governor of Pennsylvania. So, right as the Revolution's ending in 1781, John Dickinson is governor of both. Now, how does this affect John Cook? Well, Dickinson kind of realized I shouldn't be governor of both, and he went with Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania had Philly, which was one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere, and Pennsylvania was one of the most powerful states, as opposed to Delaware, which was not. That's different now. Every corporation in the world runs out of Delaware, but we're not going to talk about modern politics here. But at the time, John Dickinson went to Pennsylvania, so who is going to be governor of Delaware? Well, according to its constitution, the Speaker of the Senate should be governor. And that person was John Cook. Now, this whole time there were people suspicious, as I said, of John Cook, because John Cook wasn't necessarily so quick to jump on the Patriot train. So to ease tensions, because they needed a governor, John Cook says, I'll tell you what, I will be governor, I will try my best not to make any decisions, and I will only be governor until we can have a special election to get an official governor, and I will only be an interim governor. And everyone else went, yeah, okay. I mean, we don't have any other options, so let's do it. And that is what happened. And John Cook was the very controversial governor of Delaware for one winter in 1781 to 82. That is the story of a Mr. John Cook. And I would assume he did a middling job, because he was not there long enough. He essentially did nothing while he was there. I really looked, when I wrote this article, I really looked to be like, what did he do? Did he, the last person we talked about, John Henry, even, was only governor for a year, and he reorganized the militia. No, nothing. He just sat around, did basically nothing. Again, let me know if you have any questions, guys. I am extraordinarily happy to answer anything I can, although, as per usual, I don't know the answer to the early question of how he died. All right, I'm going to take one more sip. I'm talking a lot. And I'm about to tell you about a fascinating spy story that I had no idea about. And it's not even the spying, it's the capture of the spy. Oh man, the suspense. I'm so good at it. I'm getting good at the suspense. I'll tell you about Thomas Poole. I had never heard of Thomas Poole until last weekend when I'm, writing some art, write most of the articles on the weekend. So I'm reading it. I forget who else I was looking. I was looking at something totally different, and the name Thomas Poole comes up in his capture. And I just start diving into these notes. Thomas Poole, joined the American Revolution when the war broke out. He joined the Patriots. He served in the 2nd Continental Dragoons and was a lieutenant. He was an officer, a lower-level officer, but he was an officer. Until January 1787, when he kind of abruptly resigns. Then he goes to New York City. And it's like, is he a turncoat? What's going on with this guy? Well, that's kind of what the British said. Because, turns out, he was communicating directly with both George Washington and Benjamin Talmadge of Benjamin Talmadge fame. That's not right. The Culper Spy Ring. That movie, Turn. He's the charming one who's in uniform the whole time up in Connecticut. Not one of the regular dudes doing the work. But Benjamin Talmadge was a great guy. That's not the point. He wasn't communicate. Benjamin Talmadge ran George Washington's espionage operation. And they had chosen Thomas Poole to serve. And he does go in 1780, he goes several occasions to New York City and comes back with information. And then he goes to New York and gets caught. In September of 1780. Now this is not great, because, spies get hung. For whatever reason, they decided not to hang him. And that is not, I've read everything that the internet has to offer about Thomas Poole. There is not a lot out there on him except about his petition, which we will get to later. So, he's captured and he is put in prison, and he's in, according to his statement, he's in prison for 235 days, and not one time in that, 3/4 of a year, does he see sunlight. He doesn't have a bed. He's sleeping on the cement rock floor, and he's eating nothing but bread and water. He's beaten regularly because the British are continuing to ask him. First of all, they want him to confess that he's a spy, because that's the best thing, that's the best way to know. And second of all, they want to know who he's working with. And they want information, because they know it's George Washington. They assume it's George Washington. They want information from him. And he does not give it up. After 235 days, he's still prisoned, but he's brought out and exposed to the elements. And then they bring him back in and expose him to the elements, and essentially is tortured for several years. Until August of 1783, a month shy of 3 years of captivity. No, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. 2 years into his captivity, he's brought from his prison to Bermuda, which was a British island. And he's kept there for several months, and then they bring him to New York City. I don't know if they're trying to torture him or if they think they're going to exchange him or something, but they bring him to New York City for a few months, and he never gets off the ship. and they bring him back to Bermuda. And it's in Bermuda, the second time, in August of 1783, that he escapes. But his trials are not over, because though it's been 3 years since he was captured, he's escaped on the island of Bermuda, which is a British-held island, and it takes him another year and a half to get back to the United States. And he doesn't make it back to the United States, until May of 1785. He was captured in September of 1780. And he gets back to the United States in May of 1785. 4.5 years, 5 years later, 4.5 years later. Well after the war's over, mind you. Like, Yorktown was 4 years before this. The treaty took a long time to get signed, but that's all signed up. He finally gets back, and then he gets back, and he had a wife and young children who had no idea where he was for years, and they had enjoyed the charity of their neighbors for a good amount of time until eventually he said, I guess, he's not coming back, and they started going into debt to survive. So he comes back, which is sweet for everyone, but he's like, oh, not only have I not been working for 5 years, but now my family's drowning in debt. So he petitions the Continental Congress in mid 1785, about 6 months after he gets back, the autumn of 1785. He petitions the Continental Congress. And not only does he tell them his story, and that's how we know this story, is he tells them, but several other people speak on his behalf, including George Washington, writes on his behalf. Hercules Mulligan, which I don't know if Muscle Man's here, but I know you're a Hercules Mulligan fan. Hercules Mulligan was also acting as a spy at the time and was present while they were beating on Thomas Poole early in his captivity. And he couldn't stop, like he was pretending to be British. Like, he wasn't going to give up his, oh no guys, don't do that, hang me. So he testified a few months after the original petition was, and Alexander Hamilton also testified. And what I noticed, I don't know, don't ask me how I noticed this, but somehow I noticed that Hamilton and Mulligan, though they testified several months apart, they said literally exactly the same thing. Literally. They said that he, quote, suffered everything he could bear without the loss of life. The only difference between their two statements is a little bit of punctuation and capitalization. Everything was one word in one and two words in another, and loss of life both had capital L's. But, they must have been talking about this. I can't believe this story isn't better known. I'm shocked when I'm reading this. I'm like, how is this not the story? How is this the dude who doesn't have a movie made out of him, And this, I also noticed this, that it was September 7th, 1786, 6 years to the day that he was captured, that the Continental Congress approved his petition and gave him money. I don't remember the exact number, but it was about $1,000, which doesn't seem like a lot, but back then, this is several years' salary, and he took that to pay off his loans, and he went to Connecticut, where he moved to New London, Connecticut, and he had a tavern that he kept for the remainder of his life, and he lived another few decades. That's the story of Thomas Poole, who, leave me a comment. Let me know if you've ever heard that name before or that story. Because I'm really proud that I discovered that story, and I hope you enjoyed it. A vacation, Matthew. That's a dark sense of humor, but I appreciate it. You've gotten to know me very quickly. Alright, so we got two more. I'm going to take a quick sip. These ones are, this one is definitely a little bit shorter. James Reid. Not to be confused with George Reid, who signed the Declaration, whose name is spelled differently, or Joseph Reid from Philadelphia, who was an aide-de-camp to George Washington and a governor of Philadelphia. I could not find any relation. If they were, it's centuries beforehand, from back in England. James Reid is another name that I'm surprised more of us don't know. I'm sure people from New Hampshire probably recognize the name, because he was from New Hampshire. James Reid signed up right away when Lexington and Concord. James Reid had already started a town in New Hampshire and was a lieutenant in the New Hampshire militia when Lexington and Concord happened. Start there. And when news of Lexington and Concord got to New Hampshire, men went down to sign up to fight. Reid was one of these people. Now, when they gave out colonelcies, they gave out regiments for the can't get it out. They gave out colonelcies to lead a regiment. There were 3 regiments from New Hampshire sent to Lexington and Concord, and Lexington and Concord had already happened. They were sent to Boston and would fight at Bunker Hill. And these were John Stark was given the first one. The second name, I think it's Enoch Poore, if I'm not mistaken. And the third one was given to James Reid. So he was one of the 3 men leading New Hampshire militia to Boston in the aftermath of Lexington and Concord. He fought at Bunker Hill and proved himself. When George Washington arrived, yada yada yada, some time goes by, and in November of 1775, they reorganized the Continental Army. There's a meeting, and I have more reading to do about this meeting, and I'm going to write about this at some point, but essentially there's a meeting between George Washington and some of his major generals, 3 representatives from the Continental Congress who had traveled to Boston, who I believe were Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Harrison, whose son and then great-grandson would be presidents, and Thomas Lynch. Those 3 men traveled from Philadelphia to meet with George Washington, and then the governors of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. They all come together and have this big meeting to decide, okay, like we can't just be separate militias. Like, we need to come together as one army somehow. And again, there would happen, they would form the Continental Army, but the militias would still essentially be their own armies. But because of this meeting, they would basically default to Washington's opinions at any given point in the name of unity and organization. Because when you're running an army, it's my understanding that knowing who's in command and the chain of command is extraordinarily important. And that's essentially what they settled here. And out of this, they come out naming people into positions. And James Reid is named a colonel, which he already was a colonel in the New Hampshire militia, but now he's a colonel in the Continental Army. And not only that, but they give the order of seniority. And he is the number 2 highest ranked colonel at the outset of the Continental Army, at least after this reorganization in 1775. Number 2. And after John Sullivan, who was named a brigadier general right at the beginning of the war, John Sullivan. Not his brother James from Massachusetts, John Sullivan from New Hampshire. John Sullivan's the number 1 guy from New Hampshire. James Reid is the number 2 highest rank military man from New Hampshire in the Continental Army. He does some fighting at Bunker Hill. He goes to New York, does some fighting there, joins the invasion of Canada, is there when they're evacuating Canada because it doesn't go over so well. And then he gets sick with what George Washington called smallpox. There's some controversy over exactly what made him sick, but I'll go with Washington's assessment, even though he wasn't there. But what was told to George Washington is he had smallpox. Now, as he gets sick, the Continental Congress recognizes some changes need to be made. And John Sullivan is promoted to Major General. And they realize, hey, we need another Brigadier General from New Hampshire. Because they're trying to get one from each place. There's a bunch of Frenchmen coming in, taking over Brigadier and Major General positions. So they say, hey, what about this guy, James Reid? He's doing a swell job. And they appoint James Reid as Brigadier General in the Continental Army. One of the highest ranking Brigadier Generals in the Continental Army, the same day that John Sullivan's promoted. And again, the only Brigadier General at this point from New Hampshire, the second highest ranking New Hampshireist? New Hampshirean? Anyway, second highest ranking guy from New Hampshire in the Continental Army. And they send him his commission. And when he gets it, he cannot accept. Because while he was fighting in Canada, he came down with the smallpox, and he went blind and nearly deaf. And he had to resign immediately. He didn't resign immediately. This was in mid to late 1775. And he resigned in January of 1776 and went home and could not participate again. The good news is he lived another 30 years and was really successful with his tavern and seemed to live a pretty happy, fairly healthy life after that. But I guess it's fortunate we don't have smallpox anymore, because that's the sad ending of the second highest ranking general from New Hampshire. I'm surprised we don't hear more about it. Probably because John Stark was not super happy that Reid was the one getting promotions, and John Stark's famous. He's the one who came up with the live free or die that New Hampshire's so proud of. So, if you have any questions, I saw something coming in. TJ, you didn't know Poole. No one knows Poole. It's crazy, right? It's absolutely fascinating to me. Excuse me. Quick sip, and we will finish up here, because we are on the last one. Now, I don't see King, what is your name? King Charles? Were you King Charles? I have it written down here. King Charles, yes. King Charles, who frequently joins us here and sometimes comments, recommended a while ago that I do Manasseh Cutler. Manasseh, I believe it's pronounced. Cutler. And this is a name I've known for a while. He did a lot of things. But what I'm going to focus on today is his relationship to the West. Excuse me one second. Go. Get out of here. Get out. Man, my cat, she's kicking at the door. She wants to come in. I give you dead air to let her in, and she runs away. And now she comes back and she's kicking the door again. But she's my kitten, so I can't stay mad at kitten. If she were a human, maybe, but no, not my kitten. Anyway, let's finish up. Manasseh Cutler, he was a man of many trades. He was from Massachusetts. His family was full of preachers and pastors and not preachers and pastors, the ministry. They wanted him to follow suit and join the ministry. And he said, no, not for me. So he studied to be a lawyer. He was a school teacher for a while. He did a little bit of surveying, it sounds like. He was a grocer. He did a whole bunch of stuff, and then he gave up and became a preacher like his father anyway, because, dads always seem to be right. So he does that, and then the Revolutionary War breaks out. He joins as a chaplain. He serves as a chaplain for several different militia units. Most notably, he didn't serve directly for John Sullivan, but John Sullivan's famously not so great Battle of Rhode Island, the Rhode Island campaign. He is a part of that campaign, and he serves as a preacher there. Goes back to Massachusetts. Wanted to do more trades. Was a man of many trades. Didn't make that much money as a preacher, so he learned how to be a doctor. He learned basic medicine to help out his community and make some extra cash on the side, healing the sick and wounded. Then he opened a schoolhouse. He really did a lot of jobs. So the war goes by, and it's after the war that he really becomes important, because a company started called the Ohio Company of Associates, and we discussed this last week when we talked about Rufus Putnam, who was one of the leaders, the founders of that organization, and one of the leaders when they went to Ohio and founded Marietta, Ohio, which was the first American settlement in the Northwest Territory. But they asked Manasseh Cutler to go to the Continental Congress and speak on their behalf, and he does. He speaks to the Continental Congress, and he helps organize, he does all the backroom dealings to get this operation, the Ohio Company of Associates, well, I'll just call the Ohio Company from now on. He gets the Ohio Company a huge land grant, like 1 million acres, 1.5 million acres, I believe, and a $500,000 grant from the Continental Congress, who again at this point didn't really have the money to be doing this, but they did know they needed to settle the area. And he gets them to use this company to settle the area, although another company, the Scioto Company, I believe it's pronounced, also gets a grant because they wanted one too, and the Continental Congress was like, we can't play that many favorites. Yes, we're all wealthy elite people here, but we have to be fair to the other wealthy elite people in the room. And so that's what they did. The Ohio Company gets their first, founds Marietta. Now, it's been, King Charles, I gave a shout out, he told me to do this, gentlemen, and I believe it was, Manasseh is given credit for writing parts of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which established the rules for settling the Northwest Territory. And it was really, of all the garbage, of all the trouble people give the Articles of Confederation, the one law that it did pass that's really, really important is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. One of the things, first of all, it organized how future territories would be settled. And this is important not just for the Northwest Territory, but once the United States became the United States under the Constitution, we continued using this process to settle other states. With one exception. The Northwest Ordinance outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territory. Now, Manasseh Cutler, in some of the things I've read, does get credit for writing this part. Now, I have seen arguments that James Duane, his friend, who was a Continental Congressman and the one who actually presented the Northwest Ordinance to his contemporary delegates at the Continental Congress, that he wrote it. Though I've also seen arguments that I literally read that James Duane wasn't as good a writer, as articulate. It's too flowery language for him, which I can understand, although he's not a bad writer. James Duane is really famous, not just for this, but for writing law books, like study books for law, essentially. I can't remember exactly what they were called, but after he wrote it, all the people studying law in the United States would read it. It was essentially the volumes of American law. So to say he's not a good writer doesn't make sense, but to say he writes more legalese than flowery language, do you know what I mean? Like, it's more Constitution, less Declaration of Independence, that makes a little bit of sense. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Cutler and Duane, who were friends, as I said, probably worked together on creating the language. But either way, he did have a hand in establishing that there would be no slavery in the Northwest Territory, which was a start. Now, once the Associates did go to Marietta and start settling the Ohio region, Cutler went there one time, just to check it out. I should note that in addition to all the jobs he worked, he liked science and botany, and he helped, climb, I forget which one of the mountains in New Hampshire or Maine that he helped name. Mount Washington. I think it was Mount Washington. Don't quote me on that. Either way, he went to Ohio and, wrote about, 350 or so different plants in the area, and then went home. And when he went home, he would end up, and this is, it's weird that this is an afterthought when, a lot of founders, this is what I would be focusing on, is in 1800, he went as a member to the House of Representatives during the Jefferson administration. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives for 4 years, 2 terms, representing Massachusetts. And that's where we'll leave Mr. Manasseh Cutler, because I am starting to sweat. Do you guys have any questions or comments? I am here for you. So if there's anything else I can help you with, I'll take a quick sip of coffee and give you a second. Nothing. Drink coffee at 9. I'm going to be up. Now's the time. Alright, well, throw it in there. I'll close by reminding you, definitely subscribe if you're new here. I'm assuming most of you who are watching this live video have already subscribed. If not, definitely hit subscribe, hit like, that helps out a lot. Also, most importantly, tomorrow I will have a video that's a little bit longer than most of my regular videos where I am interviewing Christian Despigna, who wrote Founding Martyr, which I'm not just saying this because he's coming to be interviewed. I love this book. I love this book. And not just because Joseph Warren is an amazingly important person, but because this book, I've never read something that put me in pre-revolutionary colonial Boston. And this does. You really get the essence of what it was like to live in Boston at the time and what society was like. So I believe I put this down in the description as the book for this week. You should get it, read it by tomorrow, or don't, because we don't really talk about what's in this book in my interview with Despigna. He's just such a wealth of knowledge. So come back tomorrow. Thank you so much. If anyone else has anything, Kentucky History Channel, thanks, man. Thanks for coming. Everyone else also, thank you so much for coming. TJ, I'm glad you made it. Come next week, every Wednesday at 8:15. So I'm going to cut it out now, and we usually end by referencing a property owned by George Washington a long time that I talked about in one of my first live videos for those of you new here. So I usually end by saying round bottom. Go to Founder of the Day and type in round bottom. You'll see what I mean. So anyway, round bottom.